Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast, where we explore relevant projects, policies, and stories from the perspective of the communities most impacted by climate change: Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those with lower incomes. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. In today's episode, we'll discuss the limitations and potential drawbacks of clean technology in addressing climate justice and opportunities to return to cultural practices to address climate injustice. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Denise Fairchild, she/her, President Emeritus of Emerald Cities Collaborative and a ClimateBreakthrough 2021 Awardee, the largest individual award of its kind and the second U.S. awardee to date. Her 3-year, $3 million grant focuses on designing a cultural response to the root causes of climate change, unsustainable economic growth, production, and consumption policies and systems. Denise is nationally recognized and respected for her 40-year successful track record and innovative programs in sustainable and community economic development, domestically and internationally. Welcome, Denise, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thank you for having me, Aiko. I'm very happy to be in this conversation with you today.
Well, it's always great to sit down and talk with you, Denise. And again, thank you for being on the show. And before we dive into the topic, what does it mean to have this kind of support? I mean, for philanthropy to really invest in the work that you're doing right now?
Well, this was a very special gift, if I might say, in that I was given the liberty to actually think about what I would really do, sort of radical transformation I might make in addressing the climate breakthrough challenges that we have. And as someone that has come from the brick and mortar and energy efficiency and clean energy and sustainable food system perspective, I was able to stop, take about 6 months or maybe even a little longer to think about, well, what is the real source of the climate challenge? And how do we find alternatives to the kinds of economy that we have that's about extraction and promoting individualism and materialism? So it's a freedom of thought and a freedom of time. They've not only given me $3 million to use as I want, but also wraparound services. So I have research support and communication support and networks that allow me to grow into spaces that I've never been in before. So it's a really special kind of grant making that I think needs to be expanded beyond, the Climate Breakthrough Network.
Yeah, well, the award is so deserved, and we're excited to talk with you today to learn about your latest thinking and just really continue to celebrate your leadership and work in this space and in the environmental justice movement. Today, we're talking about the role clean technology plays in climate justice and why this strategy won't get us to where we need to be. So, Denise, when we think about clean energy, there's so much conversation about this. I think there's such an investment that we're making clearly in federal tax dollars, extraordinary historic levels. What's the problem with clean energy technology as it exists today, how we think about it today?
Well, from my perspective, my premise is that clean technology is a false solution to our climate challenge. And I say this to be thought-provoking, to be provocative. Well, I'm not saying that we should stop adopting clean energy technologies. These are important emergency level short-term solutions. But our existing climate policies, our technologies, and our investments are insufficient and ignore the cultural underpinnings of climate change, which is really about our beliefs and practices that are really destroying the environment. We can't be lulled into thinking that just eliminating fossil fuels, keeping it in the ground, being more energy efficient will solve our climate crisis. So, if I could just give you some examples about some of the inherent challenges that we see in clean technologies. First, let's describe it. Clean technology includes solar, wind, hydrogen, direct air capture, carbon capture, biofuels. Some of these technologies are used basically just to green our economy. We're greening our fuel sources, we're greening our buildings, our cars, our communities to reduce and to capture carbon. And this is important because it has resulted in this sort of atmospheric imbalance that's creating all of the climate disasters that we're living through right now. So we're supposed to be at, 350 parts per million of carbon. I think we're now at about 440 parts per million, which is really produced by generating and producing and burning fossil fuels. So we're really focusing on the carbon problem, which is what we call carbon fundamentalism. But the carbon crisis is really more than that. And our solutions really require us to go beyond technological solutions to reduce carbon. So what's the problem is your question. Clean technology still produces its own environmental, social, and economic justice issues. It's really taken us to a new level and form of extraction that's going to damage our local ecosystem. We're going to use lithium and cobalt for batteries, electric vehicles, and wind energy. We've got to use copper and aluminum for electricity networks. We've got to use nickel and water for electrolysis to produce green hydrogen. We need platinum for fuel cells. Now, all of these precious minerals, as opposed to fossil fuels, are still going to deal with and require extensive mining extraction, which leads to contaminated local ecosystems and water. For example, copper and lithium are particularly vulnerable to water stresses, given great high water requirements. Research suggests that 50% of today's lithium and copper production is concentrated in areas with high water stress levels. These are also non-renewable resources. They will run out. Clean energy. There's going to be a 40% increase in copper and rare mineral markets, and 60% increase in nickel and cobalt, 90% in lithium in the next 2 decades just to meet the Paris Accord agreement. There are important environmental justice issues as well. Some of this stuff is just dangerous. Hydrogen is an example. And also there's a lot of emissions associated with mining and processing. There's risks arising from inadequate water and waste management systems. There's going to be a lot of waste related to just like solar panels, right? So there's going to be an emerging waste stream that we've yet to see, millions of tons of panel and battery waste. And when you think about where most of these waste sites are located, they're located in low-income communities of color. So it'll only exacerbate sort of the health challenges that we're already facing with the fossil fuel economy. I'd also say that there's going to be labor standards issues in high-producing country where there's inadequate worker safety, and human rights abuses around the country. And these are places like China, parts of Africa, Chile, Bolivia, Argentina. There's questions of income and wealth gaps. They really don't address these clean technologies, rarely address who owns and controls these nature's resources, who controls and owns the sun and the wind and these rare minerals. So do we continue to embed inequality in this new form of green economy? And lastly, I would say a key challenge is just the issue of land use consumption. We are really focused on utility scale renewables to just absorb our energy appetite. So what's going to happen when we use up open land and spaces? What is that going to do with the productivity and the regenerative nature of our economy? So anyway, those are just some of the highlights that I see on the horizon. And I think we have to be very focused on this as emerging challenges and make sure that we're addressing them and really getting to the root cause of what our climate crisis really represents.
So Denise, how do you answer this question? I mean, it's very common when I talk with people, particularly carbon fundamentalists, as we call them, that although there are all these downsides to it, and they acknowledge a lot of those downsides, that, in order to save the planet, right, in order for us to get to where we need to in terms of carbon emissions, that we need to charge ahead, right, that we need to be able to rely on these clean energy technologies and, sort of hold our noses as we embrace those investments and to forward the particular approach that we have taken, which is to really put sort of all of our eggs in that clean energy technology basket. I mean, how do you answer that question when people say to you, like, Denise, like, I understand all those challenges, but really, like, we have no choice. We have to really do what we're doing right now.
Well, that's, I think, very short-sighted in terms of the response to what we need to deal with our climate crisis. These are, again, short-term. Our technologies are important, but they're short-term solutions. These technologies continue to perpetuate an economy that's unsustainable, that's extractive and unjust. It gives us a sense of false hope that we can continue business as usual an unsustainable lifestyle where we mass production and mass consumption and massive accumulation of wealth is the way of the world. And that's not a reality. So we are always talking about the climate clock and the urgency of the climate clock. And that's very real. And so will the use of non-fossil fuel energy sources make a difference? Yes, it will. It's going to be a helpful approach to short-term challenges, but our long-term needs of addressing deforestation and the loss of biodiversity and the fact that Westerners, particularly American society, is just 5% of the population and absorbing and producing 23 to 25% of all emissions. If we don't address that fundamental issue, then I think we're going to have a long-term challenge with addressing the climate impacts that we're currently facing. Our universe, our natural resources is not limitless. It is limited, but we are living in a world where the growth engine that we continue to grow, we want to grow 2% annually a year in gross domestic product, or 3%, or we're happy if we get 1%. But we have to figure out how to rebalance our relationship with Mother Earth if we really are serious about the climate crisis. This is not easy. Climate technologies, as it is today, is not what I call the last mile solution. The last mile solution is always the hardest. In any race, your last mile is the hardest, but the most necessary part of winning any race. And we've got to go to that last mile to deal with the climate wars.
Yeah. Well, and it seems that this conversation around conservation, around consumerism, as you're talking about, around really sort of challenging the way in which we live in our lifestyle, that we're not having that conversation as much anymore. There was a time early on around climate, right, where we were talking about things like short showers and turning the lights off. And I think for me, that was a difficult time because I felt like we weren't focusing enough on large corporate polluters, like more systemic elements. But it seems like we've kind of gone the extreme opposite, where we aren't having this conversation anymore. I mean, do you have thoughts about why we're not having the conversation that you are trying to facilitate through your work right now?
Well, I think because we have just thought, or we've been sold the notion that the technology is going to save the day. It's going to come in and we can just rely on technology to address carbon, and we have lost the ability to understand the sort of deeper nature of the crisis. And we have all partly become more and more addicted to the lifestyle of modernity, or the notion of modernity, that we live in a culture where more is better, cheaper is even more better, that disposable resources is the ultimate of convenience. But we're not addressing our addictions to modernity and growth at all costs. We have been colonized, if I could suggest that, in a way where we're happy with the way we live and we just want to keep doing it. We're just going to make it greener. The fact is, though, we have to stem production and extraction of our natural resources that's feeding this consumer culture. We are right now not even counting for the emissions that we're putting out there. We are dealing with what they call scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So that's the emissions that comes out of any, city or community, out of our buildings or the cars that we drive in a particular geographic area, out of the fuel sources that we use locally. But we're not counting what they call scope 3 emissions. The United States, nobody's even requiring corporations to even measure scope 3 emissions, which is what's the emissions that we're importing, right? So the shirt that you wear or the computer that you are buying are actually, we have this demand for stuff, right? And that demand is generated, it's pushed out to let's see, Africa, where we're extracting the minerals, or other parts of the global south. And then it goes to Taiwan, and more energy is produced and more carbon is produced when we're processing these minerals. And then the logistics of shipping that computer from wherever in the world to your front door through, Amazon, it's constantly producing more emissions. We do not account for that. So it's and they always talk about the data boogeyman. Whenever we don't want to deal with stuff, we always talk about, well, there's no data and it's so hard to collect that kind of data. Well, that's where we are with scope 3. We say, well, let's just measure the things that we know that we can calculate, locally, but let's not deal with the hard things, which is the importing of our emissions. So anyway, this is the reality that we live in, that we love the economy that we're in. We love and we're addicted to the culture that's producing our climate challenge. The fact is, what these emissions are coming from, increasingly, the majority of our emissions come from what is now called discretionary energy. And that is the energy that we use for what we want and not what we need, right? So at one point in time, we just used energy for our basic needs, for cooking our food, for heating our homes, for even moving around in our transportation. Now discretionary energy is just the stuff we just like to buy. So we've got to figure out how we mitigate this and move from a culture of individualism and materialism and objectification and competition and privatization to looking at more traditional earth-based African and indigenous cultures that have better balance with nature itself.
It's just so important that you're helping to continue to raise those conversations, which has been, the essence of environmental justice work, the energy democracy work, all these places where we've tried to have the conversation that we need to have. So I'm excited to learn more about sort of the thinking that you're doing in the context of your Climate Breakthrough Award. So can you explain a little bit more about how embracing, returning to our culture is a pathway to mitigate climate injustice, a pathway to really help us save ourselves, save the planet, and address climate change?
So the spaces that I'm growing into, it's just, to be honest, it's just really informed by frontline communities or grassroots communities from indigenous communities and even rural communities about the way we see the world, right? And in essence, what we're trying to imagine is how do you dematerialize, decommodify, and deconcretize the economy. It really requires us to decolonize our minds and our culture. And it's not easy. It's a challenge. And the way I've always talked about it in our energy democracy world is it's like breaking through the fossil fuel economy and the culture that underpins a carbon economy is like what it took to dismantle the slave economy. So it's tough, but it is doable. And the first thing we really have to do is overcome what I call cultural racism, which really requires us to revisit and reclaim African indigenous worldviews. These are worldviews that still exist today, but that have been demonized over the centuries, that have really taken away from us the way that we honor and respect nature, cultures that do not use more than they need, that are rooted in communal and sharing cultures with belief systems and our oneness and our independence with each other and other species in nature. How do we get there? I mean, part of it is getting back to our roots, right? Earth-based cultures, belief systems, and practices. And we in the African sort of ethos talk about it as Ubuntu being meaning I am because you are, I am because we are. It's a huge cultural mind shift. And it's not just limited to the African worldview and concept. It's found in so many other cultures. For example, and I may not be saying these words right, but the Mitakuye Oyashin is in the same language. It's in the Lakota culture. Kapwa among Filipinos. La Eche in Mayan indigenous traditions, Buen Vivir in Andean and Amazon forests. These are belief systems that have not been able to find prominence in the conversations about climate. And that's because of what I call, again, cultural racism. So we need to return to our indigeneity, find out who we are as a people. These concepts are a part of our cultural DNA. I think it is the source of a lot of our alienation and our isolation today, and the high rates of suicide that we're finding, particularly among young people, because we've become disconnected with who we are as a people. We have not really understood that we are a relational being in a relational world. We've been substituting for that being a material being in a material world, and that is not what and who we are. So we need some cultural reparation. We need to figure out how to get back to the land, right? You become a more and more urban society. It's very easy to not protect and care for the things you don't know and the things you don't love. So how do we really rebuild our sensibilities about the land? And I'm very excited about the new funding that's coming from this administration to deal with urban agriculture and urban forestry, and really figuring out how do we put our hands back into Mother Earth, and how do we reconnect with nature through art and music, through celebrations and rituals related to earth and notions of rights of nature. Just as an example, we're pushing this notion of freedom gardens. There was a time, I don't know if many people remember victory gardens during World War I and World War II, where Americans were asked to grow their own food as a part of the war effort. 40% of Americans were growing food, didn't matter where they lived. It was still an agricultural era, but out of windowsills and on roofs and in backyards. We need to start growing our own food as a form of climate resilience, and also just to deal with the very toxic commercial food sector. So let's get back to the land. And lastly, I think it's important that we think about how we get back to the commons. Building a commons versus a competition market-based culture is essential for growing and sustaining our natural resources. The continued glorification, commodification, and privatization of land and water resources will only increase inequality, injustices, migrations, climate migrations, and wars, unless we really forge a sharing, caring culture. So commoning is sort of this alternative new non-market economy and form of production, provisioning, and exchange that I think is going to be critical for us in the future to address the climate mitigation as well as adaptation and resilience.
It's interesting to hear you explain, how you think about the work, what you think the orientation, what the grounding should be in this approach. And it's interesting because we've had a number of guests talk definitely about that tension between technology and Mother Nature, the rhythms of nature, the role of nature, the role of culture of dominance, of control, of profiting. And I think just your explanation just really helps to context that. And I think for me really helps it become more clear about why culture, why sort of embracing cultures that have a more sustainable thinking about how we live together, how we live on this planet. You shared some examples and some ways in which we can integrate these solutions. But when you think about these solutions, why is it so difficult for people to think about these solutions? My sense is there is some sense of threat to the status quo, right? There's some reason deeper to an aversion, because it's not that this is new, right? This has been sort of how the approach has been for a very long time. What's your sense or what's your explanation for why there's a resistance to incorporate the approach that you are suggesting?
First of all, I just want to ground the importance of culture and climate based on really the work of a lot of cultural anthropologists. Culture is critical to addressing climate in two ways. One, cultural anthropologists have said that a society's ability to adapt to major disruptions depends on a society's culture. And if you're in a society like ours, whose culture is grounded on the Cartesian view of I think, therefore I am, and is about individualism, materialism, right? The survival of the fittest, these are the cultural memes we've grown up with. Survival of the fittest, pull yourself up by the bootstrap. Those cultural ethos will not serve us well when we are dealing with the climate disruptions or health disruptions or economic disruptions, as opposed to a culture of like Ubuntu, I am because we are, that where we see each other as one. So that's one very direct connection between climate and culture adaptation. The other is that, which I find most intriguing, is that there's always a cultural shift when there's a new source of energy and a new source of food. So when our energy systems change and our food systems change, we see changes in our family structure, in our educational systems, in our financing systems. Everything changes. So when we went from animate sources of energy to coal to fossil fuel, we saw a huge shift in how we operate in the world. And I'm just imagining, well, now that we're returning to energy, isn't it time that we really re-examine the culture around using nature as the sun and the wind? What's the alignment with these natural resources that should suggest a different kind of culture? Anyway, these are just sort of the big ideas I'm playing with. And to your core question about why there is a resistance to really thinking about these things differently, is that because it's a direct threat to power and is a direct threat to the market economy or capitalism, to think about doing anything that moves away from the commodification and the privatization of our natural resources. There are some very important, powerful, rich people that are going to benefit from continuing business as usual. And so this notion of a cultural shift to really, protect not only the health of our people, but the health of our communities and the health of the planet is not a part of their business plan.
And so when you think about, what you're learning about the role of culture, what are other ways in which we can integrate cultural practices into sort of broader climate mitigation strategies?
Well, I am just really enthusiastic about a lot of what I've been able to see. I've taken some time to really scan the landscape to see what's going on. And I can look in any direction without seeing this kind of this cultural work. And I don't know that people even call it that, this cultural work taking place. You look at the land back movement in the Native American community. You look at the growth of the cooperative economies, whether it's food co-ops or community energy cooperatives, even worker cooperatives. They're beginning to find sturdier legs to stand on. We've got communities into what they call buy nothing campaigns, or campaigns of mutual aids and exchange schemes. We have notions of co-housing, shared living arrangements. We have had land trusts, and land trusts continues to grow, and the whole network of commenting and just notions of new economies, alternative economies. It's just, or even regenerative agriculture. The movement is the shift is happening. And our really important work is to figure out how to spotlight this and to give it the kind of primacy and priority in our policy and our plan, community plan development and advocacy work. So there's no shortage of examples of these sort of cultural practices that are alive and living well in our communities. We just need to figure out how to scale and accelerate them.
I think that for the carbon fundamentalists, what is, I think, attractive to them is that ability to calculate the impact. It's very much about, we can tell what the impact is. When I talk to funders, it's not uncommon for them to say, well, how do you quantify equity? And how do we really know that we're succeeding in carbon emissions? How are you quantifying that? Because that's the only number. The only thing we're looking at is around that emission number. And they like the clarity of it. I think they like the ability to really calculate it, to see the numbers shifting. If we were, putting forward, the items that we think we should be watching that really facilitates the sort of change that needs to happen, some of that is that, these are not quantifiable things. But if you had the ability to really determine, well, what are we really looking at? What should we be measuring? What should we be elevating as our, sort of North Star benchmark to success? I mean, what are the types of things that you would put in that category?
Yeah, so we are definitely driven by metrics in the world. And I don't think it's that difficult to address that question, in the fact that if we're really focusing on production levels, how much we're producing, how much we're consuming, there's certain policies and ways to measure the impact of these policies that will get us to measuring progress. One is on the production side. There's several things on the production side that we could be measuring. One is a policy around durability standards. Right? We live in an economy of planned obsolescence. The notion that every 6 months you need a new iPhone or you need a new computer, or that the peripherals for those things are not working and you have to throw it out and produce something else, or that the apparel sector, you have the H&Ms of the world, and buying 10 t-shirts is as cheap as buying 2 or 1, just because we are into consuming and producing so that people can buy. So Europe has developed durability standards where you have to actually produce, what you produce has to have a tag to figure out, well, how long will this last? Is this like 2 months or 9 months? So we can begin to see how much waste that we're producing, how much we're producing and how much of it's wasted. There are even labor standards. There's some research that suggests that if the United States just aligned its labor practices along with that of Europe, where you actually have like 4 weeks of vacation or paid parental leave, and very, very generous ways of accommodating people's time and finding life work balance, that if we could just adopt different labor standards, that we could actually meet our Paris Accord, our commitments to the Paris Accord, just on different labor standards. Land use designations, right? How do we, and this is from conversations that I had with sustainability directors, that a lot of our master plans, they're predominantly dedicated, the land uses are dedicated to large industrial and commercial uses. Can we begin to shift? And these are the uses that are generating, the production that's generating the emissions. Can we shift a greater percentage of our industrial, commercial, and even our public uses into a common sector and begin to measure the impact in terms of emission reduction? And I guess probably the biggest way to look at whether we're making a difference is using non-GDP measures of well-being, as they've done in Bhutan and actually even in several parts of the United States, Vermont, for example. If we continue to measure our growth and our well-being based on gross domestic product, then we're not measuring the things that we're trying to accomplish. And then lastly, just on the consumption, and if we can measure just the spend, how much people are spending, we can measure how much people are using their time, whether they're growing food and spending more time in cooperative environments or reducing their spending, are all measures of commenting as an example, and reducing our consumption. I mean, these are just some of the ways, and I would say that if you look at the work of the C40 cities, they have an initiative looking at scope 3 emissions, and they are measuring very specifically how much in certain pilot cities, demonstration sites, how much emissions we are importing into our cities based on the demand for stuff, right? For computers and apparel, and particularly the two of the highest producing sectors of the economy when it comes to emissions. And being able to hold cities and communities accountable for the import of these emissions is a challenge, the data challenge that we're currently trying to face, and making it a policy to actually begin to measure that will have a lot to do with our ability to really control and develop a different kind of culture. Because when you control scope 3 emissions, what it does, I mean, how do you minimize importing carbon, right? Well, you minimize it by relocalizing the economy and being able to shorten the supply chain, which is really what scope 3 is how large is the supply chain. So if you're producing locally and you're distributing locally and you're buying locally, and being able to see what you're buying, what you're importing, helps you to do what we call import substitution in the economic world, is create new jobs and new businesses based on producing locally. So there's actual measures that's showing this. There are reports that show about how to begin to measure this stuff. So there's no shortage of ways to think about how to measure the impact of taking this economic and cultural shift that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm very inclined to ask you the real explicit question around race and class. I think that it's a little alluded to. However, I think sometimes people don't really track unless we're being really explicit is to what extent, and you've used terms colonization, you've used slavery. I mean, there's definitely a racialized element to this, and I think an economic element to this, an economic justice element. So just to be explicit for our listeners, and this may be the question and maybe some other question, but to get at that point, which is, how does race and economics and privilege and inequality play out in what you're learning? It's, I think, intricate to what you're saying, but again, to be explicit about that a little bit more in an answer would be, I think, really helpful.
Our consumer culture, our Western cultural values and worldview has a direct impact on Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, and even rural communities. It has environmental, climate, psychological, economic, and resiliency impacts. Living in a consumer economy, right, and not being able to address the need for our basic needs because we're trying to buy shoes and bigger houses. It's creating the mental stress in our communities between not having the haves, right, not being a part of the haves and having the have-nots. We have environmental challenges because of the consumerism and the emissions that comes out of a consumer economy. The pollution that comes out of that is impacting our communities in the sense of living around the mass production of our economy. We have the psychological stress of trying to keep up with the Joneses. And we have challenges of just being resilient because we have lost our communal culture, our ability to be resilient and working with one another because we're in this competition mode just undermines our resilience. So in my mind, it is worse for this consumer-oriented culture, is worse for our communities than it is for any other community.
I can't help but notice that on the front of clean energy, if you look at, for example, the electric vehicles that are out there, by and large, they cater to a luxury model. These are cars that are out of reach for a lot of people, the average person, I would argue, to be able to buy them. And so, at some level, we now are seeing the incorporation of luxury and consumerism being driven into the clean energy alternatives. People who have more energy efficient homes, people that have more energy efficient cars. And really, I think this sort of capitalist perspective of perhaps like a trickle down, economics, that if we get enough rich people to buy all these things, then it becomes cheaper for everyone else. And so you see this consumerism starting to bleed into the clean energy world and it becoming desirable and, a focus on sort of that being what people are striving for. And I think I'm kind of curious about your reaction to that in terms of how we've been able to move into this space. I mean, for a long time, right, people weren't buying electric vehicles because they weren't desirable, and now they are very desirable. And so how does that kind of fit into the work that you're doing and this idea around consumerism?
Really, how do we deal with this from the standpoint of high-income individuals? If we really have a issue to deal with is how to make rich folks spend less, right? Which in and of itself is a challenge because there's a sense of entitlement of being able to buy because we've monetized everything, that they can buy whatever they want is ingrained in their minds about what they're entitled to do. But I do believe that we have always focused so much on pulling our communities up to the standards of middle and upper middle class when in fact we really should be lowering the ceiling of the upper and middle class, so to buy less, to be more conscious of their resource utilization and overconsumption. And that, that messaging, that narrative has to get out there. The other part of your question was just about, EV cars and just buying, being green and becoming more energy efficient. What we're finding is that the more energy efficient we are, the more energy we use because we're saying, oh, we're energy efficient. So that means we can continue to consume because it's just consuming at a level of efficiency. So for example, they used to give away refrigerators, they thought, taking away less efficient refrigerators and giving you more efficient. Well, it turns out that people are using the old refrigerators and the new refrigerators, right? So there is this challenge where efficiency in and of itself is not addressing our emission challenges. And we really have to look at overall levels of consumption to be more in line with what's required to address our climate crisis.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that people who think that they're being more efficient tend to go out and use more energy. And, and so somehow it really is missing the mark in terms of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and that's why I think this notion of technology is giving us a false hope that everything could be fixed just with technology when really it's not addressing the cultural underpinnings of our carbon economy.
Absolutely. And what you talked about, all the other impacts that it has in terms of extraction and waste and other materials that are created and sustaining our dependence on other things that are very harmful to our planet, for sure. So, Denise, a lot of our listeners are people who work in advocacy organizations, working in cities and states and communities across the country. If they wanted to integrate your thinking, what advice would you give to them?
Well, I think if there's going to be a change, this is any cultural change, any major social transformation comes from the bottom up. It is not going to come from the top down. And so my first advice is this has got to come from us. And part of that is just beginning to have the conversation and to do this in a way that is about joy, right? This is an opportunity for us to really deal with our communities and really rediscovering who we are. It's like I call it, again, cultural reparation, reclaiming our essence, reclaiming our spirit, reclaiming our souls, right? And leading with that and not being fearful that this is out of step with what's required. I believe our cultural artists, our musicians, and our dancers, our celebrations, and has got to be a part of our strategy for moving forward, because you cannot sell the apocalypse. You cannot sell sacrifice. You got to really just get back to our roots. Recently, there's the Energy Democracy Project has developed a working group that is really beginning to address this question of decolonization, essentially. And we open up our meetings with some probing questions like, what is your relationship to your ancestors? And I can't tell you how provocative that one question has made these meetings. There's a level of bonding and introspection and visioning and hopefulness that comes out of this that is extremely powerful and motivating and inspiring. Or a question like, well, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? Or what is your relationship to the land? I mean, we've got to get back to basics in many ways and just understand how these questions have not even been posed in our community meetings, and how they need to be a part of, going after some policy or going after some politician or putting a development deal together, or financing. We've got to dig deeper internally so that then we can then begin to strategize. So part of this is, we talk about just transition, and I would say that just transition has two parts to it, right? There's like, how do we combat the bad, and then how do we grow the new? And I would say that most of our communities are really in the trenches, as we should be, fighting the bad. But if we don't also begin to take time to figure out how we build the alternative and how to build the new, we may win the war that we're fighting, but then we've not built anything that people can latch onto and to believe in. So I would say that a lot of this work can be done at a very individual level, at community level, obviously at a policy level as well, that we should be looking at some of these policies that I mentioned, and pushing durability standards, making sure that our cities are buying things that are going to be sustained, long term. We should be looking at land use designations. We should be looking at labor standards, and just even our own communities. We should be talking about how we want to measure our well-being. How do we look at non-GDP measures of well-being just at the local level? You cannot shift from an ego-centered culture to an eco-centered culture unless we really begin to teach again the power and the healing nature and the importance of nature. So anyway, these are we can start small in communities, but we can grow into a policy movement and campaigns that can really begin to shift and transform the society that we're in.
That's great. Well, I love the positive message. That's what we're all about here at Just Solutions. Thank you, Denise, for being with us today, and thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Bautista. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. So, Denise, anything you wanted to say or share that we didn't cover?
I am very optimistic with our young people. They're the ones that are moving this cultural shift that we're talking about. They're done with this notion, this myth of the American dream. They've not been able to see it. They've not been able to experience it. And even, this notion of the house and the car and all the material trappings of the Western culture is something that they're not interested in. And so I look forward to our young people. I'm working with returning citizens, who have made cultural shifts or are looking to make a cultural shift as they come out of prisons when the mainstream culture kicked them to the curb, and then they created subcultures that didn't serve them well and got them in prison. A culture of violence, a culture of gang, a culture of drugs. And they're coming out now. We're working with them to form a new culture, a cooperative culture that can help them address their core needs for housing and for jobs and for food. So there's an opportunity to move and to transform our culture through the young people, through returning citizens, so many people that have been kicked to the curb, to start something new. Great.